morning, everybody. If I could ask you to take your seats, that would be much appreciated. Welcome to this morning's breakfast briefing. We're going to have a fantastic discussion today with Jane Davidson, who has chaired the Wales Net Zero 2035 Challenge Group, and hear about how we get where we want to go. First of all, I've got a few intro slides. This is me. I've recently become the Director of Executive Education in the business school, so I and the team look after leaders, managers, professionals who are looking to us for short courses and bespoke leadership management training. Upcoming events. So two parts here around productivity, really. The next breakfast briefing will be the Wales TUC and Professor Jean Jenkins talking about the Employment Rights Bill, so the biggest change to employment legislation in a decade, aimed at increasing productivity on the basis that if we treat people well in the workplace, we get better performance and better productivity. And then also Professor Melanie Jones on the 30th of January with Torsten Bell talking about how we use the Wellbeing of Future Generation Act, again, to improve productivity, particularly in the public services. And also just to let you know that Sarah Lethbridge is continuing to run her periodic short courses on service design. So this is how to continuously improve service and product development. So we're also running the last cohort in January of the Help to Grow program. So this is for SMEs who are looking for finance, business planning help, innovation, and that last cohort runs from January to March, and then we're very hopeful that the program will run again in 2025. And just to point you to the power of the Public Value podcast, not just because I'm one of the ones that are featured in this recent round, but it's a enjoyable session with our academics who are offering something of their latest research, talking about what they do in the business school to increase not just economic, but also social, environmental, cultural value in their work. And then would be remiss of me not to point out, given the subject of today, that the university is providing a lot of learning and professional development in this space, not least Peter Rawlinson and his colleagues from the Net Zero Institute are here today. And there is a brochure that you can pick up where you can go and audit a number of courses in maths, computer science, in the business school, architecture, which are focused on sustainability in business and in products and services. So do pick up a brochure on your way out. The team here are always ready to receive inquiries, usual emails, and you can find us on the website. We will be recording and photos will be taken. If anybody doesn't want to appear in those photographs, please let us know. And then there'll be a question and answer session at the end of Jane's talk. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Jane Davidson to talk to us about the work of the Wales Net Zero 2035 Challenge Group. I must say 2025 because, I know we've got to get there quickly, but, next year might be a bit of a challenge. We are in transition, economic, environmental, social, as is the rest of the world. Jane and her challenge group have set out bravely ways for us to get there. So she's going to talk to us about the pathways to meet our net zero commitments. Thank you, Jane.
And can I have the clicker? Right, good morning to you all, Borida Ihigid, and thank you so much for coming and expressing an interest in this work. You probably have heard of it, but you may not know what its origins are. So what I'm going to do in the session this morning is to take you through not just the what we are proposing, but how and why we are proposing it. Because it's become increasingly important to me in terms of the way that we do work on issues around climate change, is that we often spend too much time discussing one aspect. So you end up, for example, with a huge amount of rhetoric about whether or not we should have a 1.5 commitment, or can it still be met, without anybody looking at how to get there. And I think one of the things I want to say to start us off is that when I was first asked to take on this work, I looked across the world to find which countries had a clear plan for how they were going to take their statutory commitments they'd made through the UN processes forward. We did not find one country anywhere in the world that had a clear plan of action. And yet the rhetoric, which we utterly endorse because of the evidence, is that we have to act urgently. So we find a real conundrum about this. And that has meant that the way we have done our work is as important as what we say about the work. It started back in 2021, although none of us who were on the group were aware of it at the time, when there was a cooperation agreement between the Welsh Government, the Welsh Labour Government and Plaid Cymru. And you'll see the explicit commitment on the screen that the parties decided to commission independent advice to examine potential pathways to net zero by 2035. The current target date is 2050. This will look at the impact on society and sectors of our economy and how any adverse effects may be mitigated, including how the costs and benefits are shared fairly. Now, this was part of a much bigger cooperation agreement that was due, and some aspects of it are still due to last until the end of this year. And although the agreement itself was in place when we started our work, the agreement was not in place when we finished our work, but this work remained part of the agreement between the two parties. And I think that's a really important point, because it is the reason that I accepted the opportunity of chairing what at the time was an empty space. I was invited to be the creator of that independent evidence. And the way that in discussion with others I chose to do it was to gather together a series of experts who had worked on evidence for many years in terms of the biggest emission reduction areas, in terms of buildings, food, energy, transport, for example, but then also look really positively at how we could look at what happens inside the education system. What are the risks and enablers? How could we create a set of pathways that would help politicians in Wales, would help public services, would help people calling for change to be confident in terms of the evidence underpinning the outcomes. We decided, and you can look at the membership of the group in the reports, but we decided to operate according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act for two reasons, really. One is, obviously, you won't be surprised to know that since I was chairing, I was very keen to do that. But I was particularly interested in the fact that all members of the group wanted to do that. Because what the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act does is propose a positive future. And I think it's really important, and I was looking at some evidence this morning that demonstrated that the words like green jobs don't take us anywhere in the general population, but acting for the well-being of current and future generations is a positive way in which we can develop a narrative. So the core elements of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, for those who are not aware of it, are on the screen. There are 7 goals linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are on the face of the Act. There are 5 ways of working on the left-hand side of the screen. They are also on the face of the Act. So the Welsh Government and all its public services, and of course those are the areas over which the government has authority and control, and therefore that's what we needed to work to, are required to think long-term, to be preventative, to collaborate, to integrate outcomes and to involve people about whom decisions are being made. I think in many ways the most important and the least well acted upon, not just in Wales, but probably by all governments. But underpinning these is not just the traditional 3-legged stool of society and environment and economy, but very importantly, the parliamentarians who put forward the final version of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act added culture as a pillar. And I think it has become absolutely incontrovertibly the most important pillar, and the single most important way in which what Wales does and what Wales wrestles with can also offer lessons to the world in other countries wanting to go down this path. And there are now many. I think if you talk to the commissioners, there's some 30+ countries actively considering either legislation or action in support of future generations at the moment. But by framing our work in the context of where Welsh Government could best intervene and its public services, by framing it in the context of what is now effectively a new constitutional framework, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, we wanted to ensure that what we did was useful to everyone in terms of both the how to do it as well as what to achieve. What we've done in terms of the reports, they're all online. They were launched at the end of September. You can see that there is a short summary report. There's a report looking at enabling the transition. And then we get into the sort of core areas about, well, what could education, jobs and works look like in 2035? How could Wales feed itself by 2035? How could Wales change its kind of like energy by 2035, taking out fossil fuels? How could Wales heat and build homes and workplaces? And finally, how could Wales look at totally changing the kind of issues around connection and transport by 2035. But for those of you who've not looked at them yet, and it'd be really interesting to hear from people who have looked at them, I think the really important element is how our reports work. So what we've done in each case is we've introduced the areas that we've covered and also been very clear as to why we've chosen those, and that's on the basis of evidence. We've laid out pathways to delivery, and these are 10-year pathways. So we hope that if our reports are successful, that what we will see in the budget, and obviously that process is ongoing in the Welsh Government at the moment, that what we'll see in the budget for 25 to 26 will be actions that reflect on the evidence that we've created. We also hope that by laying out our reports in these ways, that they will contribute towards the work of the Climate Change Committee in terms of it being a statutory advisor, not just to the UK government, but to all governments in the UK. And they will be giving their evidence to the UK government in February, and they give their evidence and advice to the devolved governments in May. And so the Climate Change Committee we work very closely with during our work. So if we can influence the budget, if our outcomes are influencing what the Climate Change Committee says to both the UK government and the devolved governments, and then obviously we would be wanting to see manifesto commitments for the next Welsh general election. So we've very carefully pitched our timing in terms of starting our work at the beginning of 2023 and publishing in September 2024. So the pathways are looking at why we've chosen particular areas, evaluating all the evidence around that, laying out immediate term, which we've called 25 to 27, near term from 27 to 2030, and long term, and I want to almost put inverted commas here, from 2030 to 2035. So on each of the areas that we're working on, there is this analysis, and then there are detailed policy proposals to lead to the outcomes we propose. So it is a pathway to delivery rather than another series of recommendations. And as an ex-minister, I have to say, I used to receive about 300 recommendations a week from different organisations. I'm absolutely confident that with the rapid increase of social media since I left government in 2011, that ministers now probably literally have something in the region of 1,000 recommendations a week for how they should do their job better. So we deliberately decided to take an approach that was actually absolutely delivery focused. But the challenge now to you, as people interested in this, is have we got the right delivery mechanisms? If you look at our policy pathways, are they the right ones? Are they linked back appropriately to the evidence? We see this almost as the beginning of really substantial work, not just in Wales, but there's a huge amount of interest in this work elsewhere as well. So we talk about the opportunities, we talk about the summary of the pathway advice, including the references and case studies. So the pathways laid out, but then later in each report, we are very clear about why, what the references are, the case studies, the basis of the evidence, and we lay out how we've approached it in each individual area. And the reason that I'm saying it like this is because I was a convening chair, and I convened a series of experts and basically said to them that they could go away and do this however they wanted. So we did it through a series of what we called reference groups, and they went out and took evidence. They went out had wide discussions with others, and they brought that back to the whole group. And at all points, both the group tested the evidence regularly, and also that evidence was presented to our commissioners. They were presented in quarterly meetings to both the relevant ministers and the representative of Plaid Cymru, Sian Gwenllian, who stayed with us the whole way through. If we look at the reports themselves, all I'm going to do in this session today, and I hope to whet your appetite to kind of read the great amount of detail, is actually to look at the kind of core messages that have come out of each of the reports. And so there's going to be a slide for each of these now. There has to be a significant step change. We have to move away from that rhetoric to action. And I should say also, because I know that the phrase net zero has kind of entered a culture war, is that it probably wouldn't have been our choice, but that's what we were commissioned to do. So we looked at all the sort of legal interpretations of net zero and published them all. And our fundamental proposition was that we need the emissions reductions. They are quantifiable, and therefore, how can Wales quantify emission reductions in a way that leads actually to better opportunities for people, for current and future generations? So we were really focused on what the co-benefits can be of our propositions. And that is, as we say here, and we can evidence it, about improved public health, reduced pressure on the NHS, greater energy security, more resilient food supply, and low carbon job generation. But if we don't take the urgent action, then we will find it more and more difficult to reach the benefits of that net zero transition. And, you know, we're already seeing, if we look at, I mean, in the case of Britain, it's been floods, but in Canada, it's millions of hectares that have been lost to wildfires, which we don't even see on our screens anymore. I've just, when I finished this work, I have just literally coming back from walking the Camino from Porto to Santiago. I always have it's a great thing to do, is actually to walk off something, to get your head in the right space for something new. And in doing that, I was walking through hundreds of hectares of burnt forest in Portugal, and Europe is really struggling on these fronts. So we're seeing these things of an order that we've never seen before. We're seeing the evidence saying that they're all increased in the context of climate. But if we need to actually take the urgent action for a net zero approach. And I think really the kind of probably the most important point on that slide is that only a planned transition can be a just transition. Wales doesn't have a lot of money. Wales is not going to be able to cope with a whole series of unplanned shocks in a coordinated and effective manner. So we do need to plan our way into delivering the most effective outcomes. Now, the slides will be made available, so I'm not going to read my way through all the slides, but just make a couple of points on the rest of them. But I just thought those points about we need to start now, it is urgent, the evidence is there, planning will deliver better outcomes, and there are many co-benefits, is a really important and hopeful and optimistic place in which to start. Now, when we look at enabling the transition, this is about, well, what are the risks and what are the enablers in terms of delivering changed outcomes. Sometimes they're political, and I think that one of the critical elements is, where does it lie inside government? I mean, we have climate explicitly mentioned in 2 of the goals of the statutory piece of legislation, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It is climate and nature, probably the biggest immediate crisis famous. They are the underpinning crises that will affect everything we do on the economy or anything else. And so do they need to be in a specific political place so that people feel confident that the leader of the government in Wales is also taking on and holding the ring for this responsibility. Now, as an ex-minister, you know, I kind of like, I'm always slightly suspicious of things where we say, if you give everything to the First Minister, then that responsibility will be better taken care of because of the hierarchy in ministerial responsibilities. But actually, I think in this case, if you don't have this responsibility with the First Minister, now in our case in Wales, Hugh Arranca-Davies was made Deputy First Minister while we were doing this work. So I think we're all very comfortable that if it stays at least at First Minister and Deputy First Minister's office, then we can say something really solid about the fact that this is putting it right at the head of elements in Wales. And I think another very, very important area goes back to that word involve in the 5 ways of working. How do we support collaborative action across household communities, local businesses, and other organisations? I mean, we've seen a lot of criticism of ESG mechanisms, a lot of criticism about carbon mechanisms that businesses have paid for in looking for outcomes, and they're not there. So how do we get real change? And local authorities, we feel, are absolutely key in that, working with other partners. The other thing, and this is a message in Wales that is not often heard, is about where we get finance from. We are absolutely clear that there is insufficient finance from both the UK government and the Welsh Government. And therefore, we need to look at different blended finance mechanisms, public, private, and citizen finance. We do see pensions as something very important in this space. So we think establishing a Wales Wealth Fund will be really useful to help take things forward. And we talk about restoring nature at pace and scale. And in fact, in my foreword to this set of reports, we talk about nature a lot in the reports, but more generally. And we do think there needs to be a second piece of work. I'm not volunteering to chair it because I think it needs different expertise to that we had in this group. But I do think that we need a second piece of work that will actually drive what needs to happen in nature to get the appropriate carbon sequestration. There's already been a lot of support for an idea of a national nature service in Wales. What could that National Nature Service really do, and how could it behave, and what could it deliver? I think would be a really exciting parallel piece of work to actually give you both the delivery in terms of emission reduction and the kind of appropriate actions to take in nature. And I should probably say one other thing at this point, particularly before we get to questions. We were not looking generally at what Welsh Government was doing in policy while we were doing this work. So, for example, when we talk about our food work, we were not looking at what Welsh Government was doing on sustainable farming. We were looking independently at what we felt the best routes were to any delivery in any sphere. Education, jobs, and the future of work. I think what's been really fascinating about this, and I was talking to a set of young people in a Saturday school literally last Saturday, talking about their experience of having issues that are highlighted through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in their education. And it was really telling in a group of young people between 6 and about 15 that none of them felt they were getting enough on issues around sort of nature and climate in their education system. And I think that this is, if we think about the way in which we traditionally have taught the economy in all aspects of education systems, in school, in college, in university, we have to think about this in the context of the way of the kind of new economic approaches. It has to be something that people have a basic understanding of right throughout their education system, and that needs to be inputted at all aspects, whether that's in any of those physical vehicles or in the context of lifelong learning. We also thought there needed to be very clear opportunities for how people can move from skills in one job they might have done for many years to another. And it was just interesting hearing from Pete what the Net Zero Institute here is going to be doing in terms of helping that sort of professional development model. But we did think that professional development models, new kinds of apprenticeships, in one sense, kind of things that you recognise because that's helpful not to make too big a jump to change, but they have completely different content in terms of how you drive this agenda forward. And very importantly, I think in the context of higher education in Wales, well, actually all tertiary education, we need to understand what institutions are doing. I mean, I spent 10 years introducing sustainability initiatives in University of Wales, Trinity St David, and it was a battle most of the way. And when I talk to other institutions, I have yet to find an institution in Wales, although the University of the West of England is now rapidly recruiting people on the basis that it has shifted to make sure that all students experience mandatory modules linked to the challenges they're likely to face in their working lives. So it's all about a carbon and nature literate workforce for the future. And in terms of how Wales feeds itself, this is our biggest report. It's in many ways our most nuanced report. It's trying to look at the kind of critical elements about what we could do in 10 years to both secure that just transition, and that's not just for farmers and growers, and we want that both those groups extended dramatically in terms of numbers, but it is about long-term financial support. And I'm not sure that you will necessarily know, but so much of farmland in Wales is in tenancy agreements. And those tenancy agreements prohibit action by the tenant because they have to leave the land as it was when they started, quite often in terms of their obligations. So you actually, just something like that, those natures of tenancy agreements absolutely militates against the kind of farming and growing we're going to need for the future. So and it was really useful having a farmer who is 12th generation farmer, Welsh speaking, was the chair of the Oxford Farming Conference 3 years ago, Will Penry Evans, on the group, so that we actually, heard what it was like in an individual setting in Wales and what could be changed for the better. So we looked at the kind of economic and circular economy approaches here, and we looked also at the sort of spatial element. And we're absolutely certain that the evidence base has to be rapidly increased here. We need a land and marine use framework. We need a national food strategy. The wording, you'll see, very careful wording, reducing the dominance of livestock production and incentivise growing a wider range of sustainable crops. But also this very important point, which is linked to the previous one about food literacy within the education system. And when we look at, in many ways, the food is an area which is still unsung in terms of its impact. I mean, it's massive impact in terms of emissions, but it is still an area where countries are only starting to look at food strategies. They're only starting to realise the impact of changes, whether that be on tariffs, whether that be on the loss of membership of the European Union. All those things have affected food systems in the UK, and there could be further effects. But in many ways, in areas such as energy and buildings, the evidence is more clearly laid out. And one of the things that comes up time and time again is the planning system. And although there has been some changes in the planning system, we feel that it really doesn't go far enough. The planning system has to facilitate rather than be lukewarm about change. If it wants the change, it's got to help it happen. And so that's a definite message to government. But there's also, the role of the national grid, the role of the UK government. There's what about industrial decarbonisation? So we had the representative who's looking at zero, working with the sort of 6 biggest industries in Wales, or Net Zero Industry Wales, was an observer on the group. So our members were all volunteers. They gave their time free, but we had all the key observers on the group from the Welsh Government, Net Zero Industry Wales, Climate Change Committee, etc., so that everybody was aware of what we were doing at all the states. The devolution of the Crown Estate, that's being very beneficial in Scotland financially, but we do know also that the devolution of any system can be really bureaucratic, and therefore we have to have the appropriate mechanisms to make sure that the devolution doesn't slow down the delivery, which is going to be a critical element. But probably our most fundamental proposition is needing a baseline for community benefit funds. So there is substantial and real benefit, and not token benefit, to local communities. In terms of the heating and building homes and workplaces, you won't be surprised surprised to know that when you've got heat pumps are so much more efficient than anything else, heat pumps have to be the answer. But how do we get people to take them on in a rapid way? So it's about funding insulation for fuel-poor homes, launching new loan mechanisms for homeowners, local delivery partnerships, and once again, this big issue about how you trade. It's probably it was the clearest and most obvious route, I think, of all of them. And it's just about how quickly can we get it done. And yet they were the very team that, because this is in people's houses, of course, it's not a quick mechanism. The incentives have to be sufficiently attractive. The mechanisms for delivery, the support through the processes, all have to be sufficiently effective to get this done at scale very quickly. So although this was the only group that said that, yes, it could be achieved by 2035, but it would have to be so radical that it shouldn't be achieved by 2035. Whereas in all other cases, they felt the feeling that the evidence was that it could be achieved by 2035 and at the right pace. So I think that how quickly you can do this stuff is the biggest challenge probably that we're going to sort of face in taking this forward. And this is a really interesting area, particularly as somebody who lives in a rural area where I just watch empty buses going up and down each day and looking at the fact that they cost those local authorities an enormous amount of money. How do we change the way that we travel? So there, we worked with some incredible experts in this area, but the travel less is what can we do digitally, and therefore how can we make sure that we've got the effective broadband across Wales? How can we create more opportunities locally? How can we upscale, repair, refill, reuse schemes, etc.? But then it's also how we travel differently. You know, which groups need to travel and need to travel to so much that actually we should provide their travel free. And we decided all those under the age of 22 actually should have free travel. I mean, we've played around with this in Wales over the years, and then we also needed to make sure that all local road improvements should have active travel at their heart. Because what happens, and I've seen it myself, is that you design it in, and then along comes that horrible phrase, value engineering, and that designs it out. So you end up with something that's no good for anybody, because you might not have a pavement or a hard shoulder or a cycle lane as a result. But one of the big things is, you know, we've got all these public sector partners in Wales with duty under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I mean, all of this should be the norm now in terms of any of those areas are developed. So we do want to look at how we can decarb the commute. There's a very exciting, I think, role for Sustrans and others in this area. And then how we travel better. Wales is almost significant in not having this last mile element. There's all sorts of places in the UK and abroad where you're seeing that the last mile is delivered by cargo bikes and all sorts of other things. So, you know, why aren't we looking at incentivising rail freight? Why aren't we looking at small electric vans and cargo bikes for last mile deliveries? Also living in a rural area with neighbours who seem to be very keen purchasers. I mean, we literally end up with 3 or 4 DPD vans, sometimes every day, coming up our track, which is just ludicrous in terms of reducing carbon for the future. So I think this is an incredibly exciting opportunity to rethink all of that. So that's it. And I just thought we'd finish with the fact that this would not have happened, this piece of work would not have happened without having a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales. And the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and in particular, the idea of the Commissioner, has now just been adopted by the UN at its General Assembly in New York at the end of September. And the UN General Secretary has been charged with the responsibility to report back over the next few years in terms of what Envoy for Future Generations roles could look like, and countries' greater commitment to future generations. And sometimes these ideas can become the spur for delivering better outcomes. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Jane. That's a tour de force. And I mean, I note a couple of things really that, you know, you've given us a route way into the routeways in terms of asking people to read those reports and the evidence that's in them. And clearly you couldn't go through all that evidence today. You're going to take some questions. But I also, in our previous discussion, I heard you say if people have really specific and very detailed questions about the evidence, then to get in touch with you, and you would then ask the experts to kind of think about what they're saying. So we have an opportunity to ask Jane about what she's talked about today in terms of the broad overviews in each of those areas. But, you know, Jane's very generously also offered to field questions if they are detailed and specific around the evidence to the experts. So thank you for that. So a chair's privilege, I'm just going to ask you a quick question. You mentioned at the beginning that you looked around the world to see what other countries had done in terms of routeways, and that nobody had yet set out a clear plan. In the distance between starting and finishing the work, have you seen other countries following this methodology, or, you know, where are we now in comparison?
Well, I think I haven't looked back at other countries in that context at the moment. And I would like to say actually a very big thank you at this point, because one of the things I asked Welsh Government to do when we started this work was to commission the Wales Centre for Public Policy to do updated academic analysis of the best opportunities in terms of delivering an agenda in Wales. And I cannot thank them enough. I think there are a couple of people in the room, you know who you are. And the work is superb, and I would recommend anybody to read it. They've written individual reports on each of the areas that we focused on, so you can look at their report and our report. So their report came first, and in essence, what we did as a group was tested whether or not their academic evidence stacked up when we then relayed it to others and had wider debates. So we feel that what we're offering, in the same way, in a way, as the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, is what we're offering to other countries is a way of working that may help them and then may also help us. Obviously, you know, countries have obligations in terms of their nationally determined contributions, et cetera, which have been debated ad nauseam at COP. But I think in terms of citizens in countries understanding what needs to happen, I think that what our pathway approach can do is be helpful in terms of people being able to look at something and also challenge it. I think that's the point. We are always up for challenge, because if you're the first person to do something, then actually you won't get it always right. But we have worked off the best evidence to deliver the optimal routes to delivery. And that, I hope, then feels that people feel confident that they have a how to do it, they have a why to do it, they have a what to do, and effectively also anybody who chooses to challenge Welsh Government or public services on lack of delivery, you know, can use these reports as well.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so we've got the evidence and you set out some routes to action, which I think is great, because this is such an enormous change for all of us. It's very hard to know where to start sometimes, isn't it? So just wanted, if you wouldn't mind just expanding a little bit on the role that you see around local authorities that you've set out in terms of their coordinating role, around bringing together business and the community, because I think for many of us, our route to actually taking action will either start at work or in our communities.
Yeah, I mean, local authorities are critically important in this context, because government can make policy, but government doesn't deliver policy. Policy has to be delivered through a range of mechanisms, through the responsible authorities, whoever they are. But also, I think it's about how you win a debate. I mean, I think the 20 mile an hour issue in Wales is an absolute classic about how we have a culture war on something that's improving people's health, making people safer, preventing child deaths. And actually, it's become a culture war because there was inadequate involvement and explanation at the outset in terms of engaging fully with why the government was going down this route. And I think it's a sort of cautionary tale, because everything can become a culture war nowadays. So you do have to be very clear about what the benefits are going to be, so that the benefits outweigh any of the perceived problems. So I think that using that, local authorities have an enormous opportunity to engage with their local populations. A number of them are going to have to engage with a lot of their local populations very quickly at the moment over issues of flooding, for example. But it's better to engage before rather than after events, and that's the sort of planned transition role. So I think there is something about the way in which the duty to involve, which at the moment is statutory but has no expression in terms of its delivery. So there is no clear advice, or there's no statutory advice on what involved looks like. In fact, there's no statutory advice on what long-term looks like, what prevention looks like, etc. So I think there's a sort of next step, which I know that the Commissioner for Future Generations is very interested in. And in fact, my next book is going to be about is what does governance for future generations look like, and how, therefore, can we help governments in Wales and elsewhere to think about, well, what do these elements mean in the context of engagement with the population? And I think there are really exciting and innovative ways of doing it. Participative democracy is becoming much more interesting, but there are many other mechanisms as well. And I think that how could we, as the first country to have this sort of legislation, and therefore a brave piece of work about speeding up climate activity, find a standing way of engaging with populations, for example? That might be something of interest.
I think it's absolutely of interest. We recently did a piece of work on mainstreaming equality into the transition to net zero, and it's clear that I think policymakers want that help and advice. That they are a bit frustrated with engaging people after the fact. Policy has been sort of arrived at, and then they engage. And I think a mechanism for policymakers to work with and collaborate with in a properly integrated way would be fantastic. Right, enough from me. Questions in the room or questions online?
We do have a question online already.
Yeah.
David James is online. David, do you want to unmute and ask your question to Jane?
Yeah, sure. Hello, Jane. My question is, I totally agree with you. There seems to be many definitions now of net zero in various sectors. Does the Wales definition of net zero include all emissions, including scope 3?
What we did in our work was effectively nuance all three of the statutory definitions. But for us, it does include scope 3. It is about Wales's effect on the world, not just what we do here. And of course, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, in its global responsibility goal, is very clear that what Wales does in Wales is actually the way it has to behave in terms of what it does in global responsibility as well.
Right, thank you.
So a question over here, Nick. So row 4, and then there's one right in front of you after that in row 2. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Matthew Priest from Mabbott and Associates. Welsh Government declared a climate emergency and set an ambition for the public sector to be net zero by 2030. I know a lot of local authorities adapted that as a firm target, so they're working towards net zero by 2030. The papers you're issuing is all sort of focused at 2035. Would you suggest that local authorities revisit their initial targets to potentially set a more realistic deadline for reaching net zero?
I think what we would always say that we think everybody should achieve this as quickly as possible, because that's for the good of the people of Wales and for the good of the organisations. But I think the targets in terms of local government by net zero by 2030 are in specific areas, particularly around kind of energy use. And we would expect those to be a contributing part of achieving the wider elements, because we're talking about much wider elements by 2035. So our plans are beyond the scope of the current ambition. And we would hope that people would need to be achieving the current ambition in order to achieve our plans by 2035.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a microphone.
Hi. You
Can you speak up a bit? Thank you.
Future Generations Act. You talk about de-siloing. Sorry. Okay. So from Future Generations Act, you talk about de-siloing thinking, and in the report there are lots of different sectors, lots of different elements. So I was just wondering, how did you address the interconnected or interdependent effects of one decision on the outcomes of another?
That's a really interesting question. When the Future Generations Act first came in, it was absolutely fascinating, because all the public bodies would sort of say, oh, well, I'm doing this bit for the economy, or I'm doing this bit for health, or I'm doing this bit for nature. And then the Commissioner reminded them that actually they have obligations to maximise their delivery against all the goals. And I think that is absolutely critical here. It's the idea that we are not in silos, that actually if there are ways that you can get co-benefits, so if you work in the health sector, but if you can do something for nature, if you work in local government, which of course has very broad range of responsibilities and can actually achieve in the context of culture and health as well as your main obligations, then the Act requires people to think about that. And that has led already to quite a lot of organisations in the public sector, particularly adding new nature initiatives to what they do. So I think that kind of idea that we all have a duty to maximise our obligation against all the goals is what we need to hold in our heads when we undertake any of this work. There will always be trade-offs, but what the trade-offs used to be is it's the economy, stupid, and therefore if that means we're going to kind of destroy millions of hectares of nature on the way, that's okay. That's no longer okay, because that's what got us into this mess.
I mean, I think also that each of the report areas gives out very specific routeways for the government, local authorities, the statutory bodies, and the public services working in those areas. So there's some cross-cutting work there, because there's a number of bodies in each area, or each area has a number of bodies.
But yeah, and we lay that all out in the detailed policy approaches. We say we're very clear about who would need to do what and when in order to deliver the pathways.
But I'm just wondering about that kind of cross-sector working, health working with education, transport working with the HE sector. So I just wondered, you also talk about a Just Transition Forum. Does more of that kind of cross-body, cross-sector work happen in that forum, or Is that not what that was about?
I think the interesting enough, Ireland is just introducing a Just Transition Commission, which I'm looking at with a lot of interest, because the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act gives us a basis for doing a lot of this work, but the kind of institutional delivery to create the outcomes is not yet in place. So actually, we really need to look particularly at this issue about just transition, because if we're talking about a planned transition, then actually there can be an active participation in trying to make it just. Whereas if you don't have a planned transition, then what you have is those sudden shocks, job losses, or areas that actually we would not want to see. So it's very much about using foresight, as it were, in terms of the delivery of these changes. And in a 10-year programme, which would require 2 administrative terms of Welsh Government, of whichever party, to agree to do this over a period of 10 years. And therefore, the reason I accepted the proposition at the beginning was because it came from 2 parties. Right. And that was 2/3 of the members of the Senedd.
It's about cooperation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nick, have you got another question? Thank you.
Hi, Jenny Rathbone, member for Cardiff Central. One of the things you talked about in your top lines was the idea of reviewing the planning system to facilitate what's needed to get to net zero. The whole legislative system is so sclerotically slow. And we've just passed an Infrastructure Act, which is supposed to speed things up. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you had in mind and how you were going to go about it, given that the Minister for Delivery is also the ex-planning minister and has this ambition to, completely streamline the planning acts into one easy to read, easy to understand framework.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I think if you look at the reports, what you'll find is that we're very specific about the changes that need to happen to the planning system in every one of the policy areas. But it became something that featured in almost every area. And therefore, it became an absolutely core enabler of change. But we're not general about it, we're specific about it. And that same minister, for the purposes of the rest of you, Julie James, has a new focus in terms of delivery in her new role. But she was the climate minister who commissioned this work and was very supportive of our work. So she has tracked all our work all the way through.
Okay, I'm afraid we've reached the end of our...
Oh, can I just want to offer one person the opportunity to say something?
Yeah.
If they want.
Yeah.
Give that man a microphone.
Okay.
No, just because Dan is an absolute expert and worked on the risks and enablers work, and I just wondered if there's anything I hadn't said he wanted to reflect on.
So I think just on the thanks, Jane. Hi, everyone. On the on planning, on the legislative context, we were quite specific in that that's things we can do quite quickly with secondary legislation around policy, but that primary legislation is an area to maybe things need to start the process, but we recognise that's going to take years to go through. But there's a lot of things that is within Wales Gift, and I think just more broad, and like Jane says, we're being quite specific about that in the report. And I think quite more broadly, it's this is very much about how can we increase the pace of action. So, and that might be it's just it's not something that can be put off. We have to start and iterate and learn as the process goes through as well. Yeah, hopefully it provides a clear pathway that people can start to get some momentum from.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Okay, thank you, Jane. Thank you very much for setting out what's in the reports. I hope that encourages people to investigate them. And as I say, if you have very specific and detailed question and you you need to have some expert input. Jane is happy to field that to the wider panel of experts that she was working with.
We had co-chairs of all the reference groups who are international experts in their field, so I can field any really detailed questions back once people have had a chance to look at the reports. But thank you so much for your interest, and I hope you can find this useful. I hope you will challenge government, but also push government to take this forward.
Thank you very much.